So the fact that, for example, we are always visualizing is a good enough place to start, just by understanding the very nature by which we perceive. The science of perception, for example. You'll get people who say, I can't visualize, or that's so hard for me. Visualization is so hard for me, I can't do it. It's much easier for me to just follow my breath. Then the counter to that is that we are actually visualizing all the time. And that sometimes catches people off guard because they take for granted the fact that what they're seeing and experiencing is the way reality is, when in fact, from a brain-based point of view, there is a very small window of data input that's happening. Images, sights, and sounds are coming into to the doors of perception and actually being fused by the right brain and by memory and by association and by emotion, and creating a kind of storyline. And that we take for granted that the things that we're perceiving are actually out there, when mostly, not totally, but mostly, they are undergoing a very instantaneous filtering and construction. There's like a passive construction happening on a microscopic level, moment to moment, that we take for granted or that we're not aware of. And one way of proving that is that we have different subjective experiences of the same actual events, which shows that the actual events themselves are only part of the truth, but the way that they are filtered creates what our subjective experience of them is. And so some people can have the very same experience, they can be impacted by the very same event and have a completely traumatic experience. And that's because what they're experiencing is at a very subtle level being contrived or fabricated. And so just put on for a moment your analytic lens, and you can begin to look at the world through the quantum vision and start to deconstruct everything that is hitting your sense doors as inherently real, or as concretely real, as material and as static and as permanent and as fixed. And the minute that you can start to use your analytic capability and your inference, you can see that actually the way it is and the way it appears are two different things. This table, this tanka, this body, your own body, appears, hits your brain and hits your mind as if it exists inherently. And yet if you use inference, you can see that underneath that there is the quality of, at the very least, the first quality or the first mark or first characteristic that the Buddha was talking about was impermanence. So this does not look impermanent to your immediate perception. But by way of inference, you can see that it had an origin. It started as a seed. It eventually became a tree. The tree was harvested and cut down. It was then shaped by a craftsman. It was then delivered on an assembly line, and then it was painted or whatever, and then sold. And then it arrives here, and that's where you cue in stage right, and your perception goes fixed, table. And then your perception stops there, and it doesn't see that at some point this will fall apart, and then at some point it will become firewood or become garbage in a heap, and then you keep following it down, and its constituent parts will break down into elemental parts that then become, in a way, recycled energy. But you're not perceiving that. You're inferring that. And so suddenly your inference has to press upon your conceptual or your habitual mode of perception, which is actually, from the point of view of Bob Thurman, is an extremely important skill to develop, which is called the inference of emptiness. You first start with a conceptual understanding of impermanence or emptiness or selflessness, and you test it against with critical exercising critically your faculty of inference against your habituated tendency to presume that things exist the way that they appear. And slowly that clash begins to erode the habitual sense or the habitual tendency that it appears the way that it exists. It exists the way that it appears. And as that conceptual understanding then deepens, it becomes internalized and finally intuitive, and this is what is considered the breakthrough or the insight level of emptiness. That never diminishes the actual appearance of things, one is able to perceive directly its actual nature and yet still interact with objects, the discrete objects of reality. So all of that to say, in a way, in order to visualize, you have to understand that you're consciously playing with perception, with the foundational assumption that it is reality is like a creative art. It's a painting. It doesn't look that way, and it doesn't certainly feel that way, but its nature is that way. It's fluid, and it's permeable, and you can reauthor it, and you can transform it. And that is, if you don't have that, then none of this makes sense. If you don't have that as a rationale, as if you don't have emptiness as the fundamental rationale for your reconstruction or your revisualization, it will all just be a child's game. It will all just be like a fantasy. It won't take ground. It won't take root. You'll be fooling yourself. It's not going to be compelling. So you have to have this sense that reality is much more fluid and that you're actually involved in its creation. It's not just happening to you. You are a co-creator. It's almost like taking responsibility for the fact that your life is co-created by you. If you don't take that authorship, then it's almost just, you might as well read a fantasy book and see it as a pastime. The visualization won't be a crucible for you unless you understand from the outset that you are involved in the construction of your life, the construction of your reality, the construction of your subjective experience of reality. Are we all on board with that? If you want to blend that principle with the last course on trauma, the same principle is there. Those of us that have unresolved issues in our history, when certain circumstances trigger unresolved shadow material, they can activate certain implicit emotion. Those implicit emotion then color our perception. And not only do they color the perception in abstraction, they color perception in a way that we then interact with the world based on reactive habitual patterns. So for example, if you had an overbearing parent that makes you feel suffocated and makes you feel powerless, then at work, if you have a deadline that's imposed on you by an authority figure, it may be possible that that's enough to trigger to your unconscious some implicit memory release, which will fuse your nervous system with reactive emotions, maybe shame and then rage, and then you will be compelled to act out in that way. And then we would say that the same boss relating to this in the same way to somebody else might have a completely different experience. And so largely our mind is co-creating for us that toxic interaction. And the more that we react that way as a passive victim of our own unconscious replication, the more ingrained it becomes and the harder it is to overcome it. Fair enough?